Her parents were standing on the sidewalk when they saw Jessica through the window after days of searching. She was seated in the dark, upright and motionless, her face empty, her body strangely rigid. She did not turn toward their voices. She did not signal for help. When they tried to move closer, a man inside the house spoke instead. "Leave. If you come in, I'll shoot." By the time authorities finally entered that house, the story had already begun to change shape. What started as a disappearance would soon take on a life of its own, and the man at the center of it would become known across Mexico by a name that soon needed no explanation: the Monster of Toluca. It began in late October of 2019 in Toluca, an industrial city set in the mountains about an hour west of Mexico City. Toluca is the capital of the state of Mexico, a region known for its colonial architecture and bustling universities, and tragically, for some of the highest rates of violence against women in the country. 23-year-old Jessica Guadalupe Jaramillo Orihuela was keenly aware of those dangers. She lived with her family in Toluca and was a devoted mother to her 10-month-old baby boy. Balancing young motherhood and her studies, Jessica stayed determined. She was pursuing a degree in psychology and hoped it would open doors to a better life for her and her infant son. By all accounts, she was responsible and caring. She rarely went out partying. Her days were filled with classes and her evenings with her baby at home. Her father drove her to and from campus each day, an extra precaution born of love and an understanding that the streets were not always safe, especially for young women. In Mexico, an average of 9 women are killed every day, and the state of Mexico consistently ranks among the regions with the highest levels of gender-based killings. Jessica's family wasn't taking any chances with her safety. That fall, Jessica was enrolled in evening classes at a private university in Toluca. She had actually transferred to this new school not long before. The reason for the transfer was troubling. At her previous college, Jessica had acquired an unwanted shadow, a fellow student named Oscar Garcia Guzman, who had developed an intense, menacing fixation on her. Oscar was a 28-year-old psychology student who often crossed paths with Jessica in class. From the start, something about him set off alarm bells. He would stare at her in the lecture hall, follow her between campus buildings, try to approach her at the bus stop. Jessica confided to her family, "I don't like how he looks at me. He follows me. He scares me." Her parents grew alarmed. Once, when they came to pick her up, they spotted a young man lurking behind a post, watching Jessica as she walked. A tall figure dressed all in black, who ducked out of sight when he noticed her parents nearby. That was Oscar. After that encounter, the Jaramillos decided it was too risky for Jessica to remain at that school. In a protective move, they helped her transfer to a different university, hoping to put distance between their daughter and this unsettling admirer. Jessica changed campuses, and for a time the strategy seemed to work. Life settled back into its normal rhythm. If Oscar Garcia Guzman was still hovering somewhere on the periphery of her life, Jessica didn't mention it. She had a supportive family, a sweet baby boy, and exams to study for. The future looked hopeful. On Thursday, October 24th, 2019, Jessica followed her usual routine. She attended classes in the evening. She even had a presentation at 7:30 p.m., followed by an exam. Her father planned to pick her up afterward, as he always did. Night had fallen by the time Jessica's classes ended. At 8:45 p.m., Jessica's father's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from Jessica's number. The message read, "Don't worry, I'm going to Oscar's house for a party." The casual tone and odd content stopped her father cold. A party at Oscar's house. He knew only one Oscar, the very classmate whose behavior had frightened Jessica enough to switch schools. The Jaramillos hadn't heard that name in a while, and certainly Jessica hadn't mentioned any party. A deep sense of foreboding crept over her father. Something didn't feel right at all. He tried calling her immediately to make sure she was safe. The phone rang unanswered, then went dead. Jessica had gone silent. Within minutes, Jessica's family sprang into action. They knew in their gut that Jessica would never simply drop out of contact or change plans without telling them, not in the middle of the night, and certainly not if it involved that person. Oscar Garcia Guzman was the only lead they had, and it was enough. The family decided not to wait for the authorities to catch up. As one relative later recounted, the alarms over Jessica's absence began ringing loudly that same night. They quickly reached out to Jessica's friends and classmates to find Oscar's address. It wasn't long before they got a location. Oscar lived in a house on Ponciano Diaz Street in Villa Santin, a modest neighborhood on Toluca's outskirts. In fact, GPS coordinates from Jessica's phone, the last ping before it was turned off, showed her device was in that very area, near Oscar's home. Neighbors later reported they had seen Jessica and a man fitting Oscar's description walking toward that house earlier in the evening. All signs pointed there. With dread mounting, the Jaramillo family bundled into their vehicle and drove straight to Villa Santin. By the time they pulled up outside the small single-story house, it was late and the windows were dark. There was no sign of their daughter. Before confronting the house directly, Jessica's parents went to the local authorities in Toluca to file a missing person report. It was the early hours of October 25th when they arrived at the prosecutor's office. Exhausted and frantic, they relayed Jessica's last known movements and the disturbing involvement of Oscar. But instead of an immediate mobilization, they were met with a bureaucratic wall. Officials told them they'd have to wait until 24 hours have passed before they could do anything. Jessica's parents were incredulous. They knew that in missing persons cases, the first hours are critical. In fact, Mexican law and protocol dictate that authorities must not wait to act. Searches should start at once, without delay. To the Jaramillos, it was an unacceptable response. Their daughter could be in grave danger at that very moment. They decided to ignore the advice and take matters into their own hands. Through sheer persistence, Jessica's family did manage to get a little bit of help that night. By pleading with the Fiscalia, the state prosecutor's office, they convinced a single police investigator and a few local patrolmen to accompany them to Oscar's address before dawn on October 25th. It wasn't an official search, they had no warrant, but at least an officer could knock on the door and make inquiries. When the small convoy arrived back at the house on Ponciano Diaz Street, it was still dark. The investigator banged on the front door, called out Oscar's name, and demanded to speak with him. Inside there was movement, perhaps a scuffle of feet, but no one opened up. Oscar Garcia did not come to the door. The police had no legal grounds to force entry yet, so after a tense while, the authorities shrugged and left. Jessica's family was stunned. They felt abandoned at the very doorstep of the man they believed had their daughter. As the patrol cars rolled away, Jessica's father and mother shared a grim resolve. If the police wouldn't stay, they would. They parked their van right outside Oscar's property and settled in for a long watch. Thus began night one of their vigil. Daylight on October 25th brought no sign of Jessica. The family, bleary-eyed but determined, refused to leave the area. They knocked on neighbors' doors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything. A neighbor mentioned hearing a brief scream the night before, but couldn't be sure. The day stretched on with agonizing slowness. Jessica's mother kept dialing her phone, hoping it might miraculously ring. Nothing. That evening, they again approached the house, calling out for Oscar and for Jessica, to no avail. Inside, the curtains did not stir. Night two found the Jaramillo parents camped outside once more, joined now by a couple of other family members and friends who brought them food and moral support. It was an extraordinary and heartbreaking sight. Two parents in their 40s, huddled in a van under the streetlights, staring at a stranger's home for any sign of their missing child. On October 26th, as dusk fell on the second full day of the vigil, a breakthrough and a torment came. Jessica's mother was gazing up at the house, scanning the windows for the 100th time, when she suddenly froze. There, at an upstairs window, a figure moved. A face came into view, just barely visible through the glass. It was Jessica. There was no mistaking her features. Jessica's parents felt a surge of hope and terror all at once. She was alive, at least in that moment, but something was wrong. Jessica's expression was strange and vacant. She appeared, as her mother later described, gone and not herself. Perhaps she was drugged or in shock. The family frantically waved and shouted to her. If she responded, they couldn't tell. In an instant, she disappeared from the window. But it was enough. Jessica was in that house. The Jaramillos were now more certain than ever that Oscar was holding her against her will. They immediately dialed the authorities with this news. This time, their pleas did prompt action, or so they thought. Officers told them they were working on getting a search warrant, but it still hadn't been approved. When Jessica's parents implored them to hurry, officials repeated, "Without a search warrant, we can't do anything." The law was moving at a glacial pace while Jessica's life hung in the balance. Furious and anxious beyond measure, the family even considered breaking into the house themselves. But Oscar had already threatened to shoot them if they tried. They were unarmed and outmatched. A forcible entry without police support might doom not only Jessica but themselves as well. That night, the 26th of October, now night 3, the Jaramillo family held their ground yet again. They had brought along Jessica's baby boy, the 10-month-old infant, because there was no one at home to watch him. So under the eerie glow of a street lamp, Jessica's mother cradled her grandson, trying to soothe the crying child with one arm while wiping tears from her own cheeks with the other. The thought that Jessica was so close, just meters away, and they could not save her, was almost unbearable. At one point that night, the silence was broken by the creak of the front door. Oscar opened the door and stepped out onto his threshold, confronting the family directly for the first time. He did not appear nervous or furtive. Instead, he was enraged. An aggressive pit bull strained at a leash by his side, barking wildly. Jessica's father stepped forward and demanded, voice shaking, "Give us Jessica, we know she's in there." In reply, Oscar leveled a cold stare and repeated his warning, "Leave, or I'll shoot you full of bullets." He spat out a denial. There was no Jessica here, he insisted, and they were crazy to keep this up. Then Oscar stalked back inside, slamming the door, leaving the family trembling on the sidewalk. They would not abandon their post, not after seeing their daughter with their own eyes. But the toll of these confrontations was heavy. Jessica's mother later recounted those hours as 96 hours of agony, impotence, and sleepless nights. The only thing fiercer than their fear was their resolve to stay until help arrived. The morning of Sunday, October 27th, dawned with a sense of urgent decay. Jessica had now been missing for 3 full days. Her parents were physically and emotionally exhausted. Still no warrant, still no rescue. They were living every parent's worst nightmare in slow motion, each moment a fresh torture. That afternoon, creeping toward night 4, the cycle repeated. Pleas at the prosecutor's office, promises that bureaucratic wheels were turning, then back to the sidewalk stakeout. By now, the case was filtering into the local news. Word spread about the family camped outside a house of a possible kidnapper and the baffling inaction of authorities. Yet inside that house, Jessica's fate remained unknown. On Monday, October 28th, events took a sudden and unexpected turn. Around mid-morning, neighbors noticed something odd. Oscar Garcia Guzman emerged from his house, not in his usual all-black attire but dressed surprisingly neat. A clean shirt, pressed trousers, proper shoes. He even appeared freshly showered, a detail that struck observers as out of character. He locked up and walked down the street. Ever vigilant, the Jaramillos followed at a distance. To their surprise, Oscar headed straight to the local state prosecutor's office. They watched, astounded, as the very man they accused of abducting their daughter walked into the Fiscalia General building of his own accord. Inside the prosecutor's office, Oscar sat down with investigators. Perhaps he had realized that suspicion on him was growing too obvious to ignore. In a calculated move, he gave a voluntary statement. "Yes," he acknowledged, He knew Jessica Jaramillo. She had been at his house recently, he admitted. She was at my place. But, he claimed, there was nothing sinister about it. He said they hung out briefly, and then he put her in a taxi to send her home safely. After that, he told authorities, he had no idea what happened to her and hadn't seen her since. It was a bold lie, and a partial confession rolled into one. By admitting Jessica had been with him, he placed himself at the center of the investigation while trying to seem cooperative and innocent. Investigators eyed him warily. His story didn't add up, but at that moment they had no proof otherwise. Still, this admission was enough to finally tip the scales. On the basis of his statement, essentially confirming he was the last person to see Jessica, a judge swiftly approved a search warrant for Oscar's home. The long-awaited order to raid the house in Villa Santin was at last in hand, but Oscar Garcia Guzman was one step ahead. After making his statement, he was allowed to leave the prosecutor's office. They had no grounds to hold him yet. He promptly returned to his house under the watchful gaze of the Jaramillo family. There, the family saw him do something chilling. He calmly changed his clothes, donned a baseball cap, slung a backpack over his shoulder, and walked out the front door. As he stepped onto the street, he noticed Jessica's parents still stationed outside. Incredibly, Oscar flashed them a cruel smile and lifted his hand in a mocking wave, all while a hidden camera on a family member's phone captured the moment on video. It was the last they would see of him. With that, Oscar fled. He vanished down the road, disappearing into the midday bustle of Toluca. By the time law enforcement assembled to execute the raid, later that evening, as the sun set on October 28th, their suspect had slipped through their fingers. The Jaramillo family was devastated. They had stood guard for 4 nights, only to watch the man they believed to be their daughter's captor stroll past them and escape. Determined not to leave until every possibility was exhausted, Jessica's family remained outside the now empty house. Finally, in the early hours of October 30th, 2019, a tactical team moved in to search Oscar's residence. It was just after midnight, technically the very start of October 30th, when the door was breached. Inside, the house was silent and dim. Officers fanned out with flashlights. What they discovered in those small rooms would forever shatter any hopes of a happy outcome, and would reveal a nightmare far worse than anyone had imagined. In a bathroom at the rear of the house, investigators found the body of Jessica Jaramillo. She had been bound and strangled. Bruises marred her neck, telling the grim story of how her life ended. Given the state of her remains, it appeared she had been killed at least a day or 2 earlier. It's very likely that Jessica was kept alive for several days in Oscar's home, even as her parents stood vigil outside, and that sometime around the 4th day, perhaps after the family saw her through the window on the 26th, or following Oscar's trip to the prosecutor's office on the 28th, he brutally murdered her, knowing the net was closing in. The horror for the Jaramillo family was beyond words. Their daughter had been so close all along, alive for a time while they pleaded for help just outside, only to be slain just before rescue reached her. But astonishingly, Jessica was not the only victim in that house. As they continued their search, officers noticed a section of disturbed earth in the small backyard. There, beneath makeshift dog kennels, they made a ghastly discovery. 2 more sets of human remains. The bodies of 2 women were unearthed from shallow graves under the doghouses, in advanced states of decomposition. They had been there for months, perhaps years. In that instant, the case transformed from a singular tragedy into the unmasking of a serial killer. Oscar Garcia Guzman, the main suspect in Jessica's death, was now implicated in at least 2 additional murders. Initially, the identities of the 2 unearthed women were not clear. The remains had deteriorated, and no immediate identification was possible at the scene. But investigators suspected they might be the answers to other cold questions. One of the bodies was eventually identified as Martha Patricia Navasotelo, 25, who had disappeared in Toluca in February 2019. The other was confirmed to be Adriana Gonzalez Hernandez, 27, who had been reported missing back in March 2017. Both Martha and Adriana, it turned out, had known Oscar. Martha was studying criminology at the same university Oscar attended. Adriana had been his classmate in psychology at another college. Each woman had vanished without a trace, their families left in limbo for months or years, and all the while, their killer had brazenly kept their bodies hidden on his property. It was a horrifying modus operandi. Oscar was literally living among the decomposing remains of his victims. Forensic examinations later confirmed that, like Jessica, both Martha and Adriana had died by strangulation. As dawn broke on October 30th, the news of what was found in Villa Santine spread quickly, and with it a growing sense of anger and fear. The local press, and soon national media, descended on the scene. 3 young women, all students, all somebody's daughter, had been murdered and concealed at one address. The prime suspect, a mild-looking psychology student who had managed to outwit authorities and escape just hours earlier. People were aghast not only at the savagery of the crimes, but also at how preventable at least one of them seemed. Had the police acted faster when Jessica's family first begged for help, perhaps she could have been saved. As El País would later report, the authorities had several opportunities to detain the supposed killer, and they did not do it. That realization struck a nerve in Mexico, where faith in law enforcement's urgency, especially in cases of missing women, was already fragile. Toluca was one of 11 municipalities in the state of Mexico under a formal gender violence alert since 2015 due to rampant femicides. Now the city had its own House of Horror case to drive home the point. Outside the now infamous little house, neighbors gathered in clusters, murmuring in disbelief as forensics teams carried out body bags. Some neighbors admitted they had noticed foul smells around the property in recent months, but had never imagined something like this. Fear took hold in the neighborhood. The realization that a serial femicide suspect had been living among them, and worse, that he was still at large, sent a chill through the community. The manhunt for Oscar Garcia Guzman began in earnest. The state of Mexico's prosecutor's office immediately offered a 300,000 peso reward, around $15,000, for information leading to his capture. Wanted posters with Oscar's face, a gaunt young man with dark close-cropped hair, were plastered across Toluca and circulated online. The media dubbed him El Monstruo de Toluca, the monster of Toluca, for the gruesome allegations now attributed to him. That nickname quickly caught on, splashed in headlines and TV broadcasts, an encapsulation of the public's horror. In truth, it was almost too sensational a moniker for the soft-spoken, unremarkable student neighbors had seen walking his dogs. But given what was unearthed at his home, monster seemed tragically apt. For the Jaramillo family, there was bittersweet vindication in these developments. They had been right about Oscar all along, but at an unthinkable cost. Now, instead of keeping vigil for a rescue, they found themselves planning a funeral. Jessica's body, once recovered, was returned to her family. In the first days of November, they laid her to rest in a local cemetery, even as the search for her killer raged on. Her father, consumed by grief, must have replayed those 4 nights over and over, wondering if anything else could have been done. The very day after Jessica's burial, her family would receive a gutting insult from the fugitive himself, one that confirmed his cruelty knew no bounds. As the hunt continued, Oscar Garcia Guzman did something few would have expected. Instead of going into hiding and remaining silent, he took to social media to taunt the world. Using Facebook under a pseudonymous account, he began posting messages about the case. In one astonishing post, he uploaded the very missing person flyers of his victims, Jessica, Martha, Adriana, effectively outing himself as the one responsible for their fates. Alongside, he wrote sneering commentary. In one message addressed to Jessica's parents, Oscar mocked their efforts, saying, "Don't be bitter. Around this time of year, everyone makes mistakes." "Well, yours cost your daughter her life," he jeered. He went on to add that the authorities' mistakes had allowed him to claim 6 people so far. To drive home his point, he even claimed, "By the way, I went to leave flowers at the cemetery where my pera Jessica is," using a vile slur meaning my bitch Jessica. This grotesque flourish, saying he'd visited Jessica's grave with flowers, was almost certainly a lie made to torment her family. Jessica had only just been buried. It's doubtful he actually risked appearing at the cemetery. But the imagery of the killer laying flowers on his victim's grave was deeply disturbing. The Facebook posts continued. In another, Oscar addressed the police directly, saying in effect, "To catch a serial killer, you have to think like one." He boasted that he had outsmarted his psychology professors as well. The very people trained to spot disturbed minds never realized one sat among them in class. These messages spread quickly online, causing a frenzy. Here was an alleged serial murderer, seemingly reveling in his notoriety and openly confessing to crimes, yet still on the loose. Many weren't sure at first if the posts were real, perhaps a ghastly prank. But as screenshots circulated, the authorities confirmed they believed it was indeed Oscar behind them. It was unprecedented and infuriating. The state prosecutor, Alejandro Gomez, told the press that they wouldn't be hooked in by the fugitive's boasts, vowing that, sooner or later, they would catch him. One clue to Oscar's mindset was his almost singular fixation amid all this chaos: his pets. When police had raided his house, they had seized his 3 dogs and 1 cat to ensure they were cared for, and possibly to gather evidence. This, it turned out, enraged Oscar. In his social media rants, he issued a bizarre ultimatum. If his beloved pets were not returned to him or guaranteed safe, he threatened to kill more women. To him, the logic was simple and perverse: the lives of strangers in exchange for the welfare of his animals. "I'm going to kill another one tomorrow, then I'll tell you where I buried her," he warned in one message, making it sound as if these murders were something he could schedule at will. It was clear that his primary concern wasn't evading capture or even his own family's anguish. It was the fate of his pit bulls and cat. For the people of Toluca, living under the spectre of this man, daily life took on an air of tension. Schools issued warnings for students not to walk alone. Some women in the city reported feeling as if a dark cloud hung overhead. If a suspect in multiple femicides could roam free and even talk about killing again, who might be the next target? Feminist activist groups organized protests and rallies, both to demand Oscar's capture and to highlight how Jessica's case fit into a larger pattern of systemic failure. In the central plaza of Toluca, demonstrators held photos of Jessica, Adriana, and Martha, chanting "Ni una más," not one more woman, a rallying cry against femicide. They not only condemned the Monstro de Toluca, but also the institutions that had failed to protect these women. How did a young man allegedly murder women over a span of years without detection? How could the local authorities have let Jessica's family wait outside that house for 4 days without decisive action? Those questions echoed in newspapers and on radio shows. This case had become a flashpoint in the national conversation on violence against women. Amidst the chaos, one person saw an opportunity to help in an unconventional way. Frida Guerrera Villalvazo, a prominent women's rights activist and journalist in Mexico, had been following the Toluca case closely. Frida was known for her relentless work documenting femicides and pressuring authorities to solve them. As the manhunt dragged into mid-November 2019 with no arrest, Frida decided to draw the monster out of the shadows by provoking him publicly. On November 19th, she published an open letter of sorts, a fiery column in a national newspaper, directly addressing the fugitive. In it, she called Oscar escoria, scum, and a pathetic nobody, daring him to respond. "I'll be here waiting to see if you're really so tough," she wrote. It was an open challenge, practically goading the killer to show himself. To the surprise of many, perhaps even Frida herself, Oscar took the bait. The very next day, November 20th, Frida Guerrera's phone pinged with a new message on Facebook Messenger. The sender was a newly created account under a fake name, but the voice in the message was immediately clear. In all caps, riddled with typos, it blared, "I sent you a message, you effing bitch. When you read it, you'll know it's me, Oscar Garcia Guzman." The Monstro de Toluca, far from staying silent, seemed eager to talk, on his terms. Over the next 2 weeks, an extraordinary correspondence unfolded. Frida Guerrera, the activist, and Oscar, the fugitive, engaged in a tense cat-and-mouse dialogue through texts and online chats. Frida immediately alerted the prosecutor's office and coordinated with a cybercrime unit. Every word Oscar typed could be a clue to tracing his whereabouts. The plan was to keep him talking, keep him online, for as long as it took to triangulate an IP address or a phone signal. Frida played her part masterfully, alternating between feigning curiosity, offering sympathetic listening, and subtly prodding for information, all while her stomach surely churned at having to humor a killer. Oscar, for his part, seemed to revel in the attention. He messaged Frida at all hours, sometimes up to 3 times a day. He made sure to type in caps, as if shouting his infamy to the world. In one of his early messages, he demonstrated that he was who he claimed. He described in precise detail the interior of the house on Villa Santine and the fate of the victims within. He told Frida how 2 bodies were buried under my dog's houses, and how the 3rd body, Jessica's, was left in the bathroom. He even mentioned specific books in his home, likely to prove he was physically there and not someone impersonating him. It was as if he were giving the activist a guided tour of the crime scene, perversely proud of his handiwork. "Do I have your attention now?" he taunted after one such graphic monologue. Indeed, he had Frida's attention, and that of the police working behind the scenes. Frida responded coolly, asking him, "What do you want?" The answer she got was telling. Oscar said he wanted to know the fate of his pets. His very first real question to her was, essentially, "Are my dogs and cat okay?" Frida seized on this. She realized that the only leverage anyone might have over this man, who otherwise seemed to fear nothing, was concern for his animals. So she assured him the pets were fine and fed, offering to keep him updated on them. In reality, the pets were in the custody of authorities, but soon Frida was coordinating with the police to get photographs of the dogs, evidence they were being cared for, which she then relayed to Oscar. This had the desired effect. Oscar kept engaging, anxious for the next snippet of news about his beloved creatures. Between these exchanges about the pets, Oscar oscillated between bravado, flirtation, and fury. He was following every news article about himself and would gloat to Frida about how inept the police were, how they'd never catch him. He also bizarrely ridiculed his former psychology professors at Unitec, the university where he studied, for failing to realize they had a budding serial killer in their midst. "And to think I talked about it every day," he sneered, claiming he had openly hinted about his crimes in class and none of the academics caught on. In what Frida later called delirious conversations, Oscar occasionally turned his threats toward her. He warned, "I'm going to be watching you, neighbor," implying he could reach her if he wanted. Then he pivoted, asking her provocatively if she had fallen in love with him. The sheer narcissism was staggering. He was toying with her, seeing if he could unsettle her or draw some emotional reaction. Throughout, Frida remained outwardly composed. She flattered his ego just enough to keep him talking, but drew lines when he tried to assert dominance. In one exchange, Oscar proclaimed that animals were worth more than humans, and boasted that killing women was easy for him, because they always let themselves be ensnared. It was a chilling window into his misogyny and sense of superiority. When he threatened that he might kill another woman imminently and tell Frida about it later, Frida scolded him, "Don't do anything stupid." It was a risky move to admonish a man like this, but perhaps she had gained enough of his trust by then. He didn't break off contact. Instead, he fixated even more on his demands regarding the pets. Detectives monitoring the chats noted that one dog in particular seemed to be Oscar's favorite. Whenever Frida shared info about the others, but withheld details about that one, Oscar grew agitated. Sensing this, Frida and the police team strategized to keep that piece of information, the well-being of his most cherished dog, as a card to play at a critical moment. It was psychological warfare in its own right, and Frida was carefully maneuvering the pieces. All the while, digital breadcrumbs from these interactions were being gathered. Police cyber units traced IP addresses and noted that Oscar's internet usage popped up in various locations. He was moving around, likely using public Wi-Fi or burner devices. They also intercepted communications indicating Oscar was in touch with his mother and with a family lawyer by phone. This provided additional leads. By monitoring those relatives, they could triangulate areas where Oscar might be hiding. In late November, signals placed him in parts of the state of Mexico, places like San Nicolas Tolentino and other suburbs around Toluca. Each time they closed in, though, he seemed to slip away. He had, after all, the advantage of knowing the region well and an apparent lack of qualms about living rough or on the run. By early December, with Frida's help, investigators got a break. They managed to zero in on a specific area of Mexico City where Oscar might be. He had shifted from Toluca to the capital, likely because it's easier to lose oneself in a metropolis of 9 million people. In fact, an address in the city's San Rafael neighborhood was identified, one tied to Oscar's extended family. Surveillance teams staked it out, but initially found nothing. He wasn't there when they first looked. However, the noose was tightening. Oscar was growing restless, and Frida sensed it. She decided to press for a final move. Pretending to empathize and perhaps even share his fascination, she suggested, "Let's meet, you and me." It was a bold gambit, offering the fugitive a personal encounter. Oscar surprisingly agreed, likely intrigued by the idea of face-to-face dialogue with the woman who had engaged him for so long. But he had a condition. All right, he replied, "but first the photo of my dog." Even at this climactic juncture, his priority was proof of his pet's well-being. Frida promised she'd send it. It was December 6th, 2019. The trap was set. Law enforcement had now pinpointed Oscar's general location to the Casco de Santo Tomas area of Mexico City, a student quarter near several university campuses and the Colegio Militar metro station. That afternoon, plainclothes agents quietly canvassed the neighborhood's food stalls and shops. They didn't have to wait long. There, by a street vendor, stood a man matching Oscar's description: stocky build, about 1.8 meters tall, with close-cut hair, dressed inconspicuously. He was eating a sandwich, seemingly without a care in the world. The agents moved in fast and low. In that split second, Oscar recognized what was happening. He lunged, attempting to grab one officer's firearm from its holster. A scuffle ensued, but he was outnumbered, and this time the authorities were prepared. After a brief fight, Oscar Garcia Guzman was wrestled to the ground and pinned, a pair of handcuffs cinched tight around his wrists. The 42-day manhunt was over. The Monstruo de Toluca had finally been caught. News of the capture spread quickly that evening, bringing a wave of relief across Toluca and beyond. After weeks of dread, the community could breathe a little easier, knowing this brazen killer was off the streets. That night, under heavy guard, Oscar was transported back to Toluca. He was placed in a high-security wing of a state prison, Almoloya, and later the maximum security penitentiary in Tenango del Valle, where he was isolated from other inmates for his own protection. Even behind bars, however, the story was far from over. In the coming months, investigators would unravel even more of Oscar's dark history, while prosecutors methodically built multiple cases against him. Families of missing persons from years past came forward wondering if their loved ones had crossed paths with this man. It turned out some had. In January 2020, as Oscar sat in custody, a bombshell revelation emerged. During an interrogation, and later in a recorded phone call from prison, Oscar confessed to murders that no one had even connected him to yet. One was particularly shocking. He nonchalantly admitted that back in 2006, when he was only 16 years old, he had murdered his own father. The way it came out was bone-chilling. A phone call between Oscar and his mother was somehow recorded and leaked to the press. In the audio, his mother is heard weeping, asking what happened. Oscar, sounding almost bored, tells her, "Yes, I killed Dad." The mother's stunned whisper of "Oh, son," is heart-wrenching on the tape. He then adds, "And your boyfriend's sister," clarifying he was referring to another murder. A hint that puzzled many until its context was understood. The boyfriend's sister, of Oscar's mother, turned out to be Monica Chavez Cuate, a young woman killed in 2012. Monica was indeed related to a man who was dating Oscar's mother at one time, making her, roughly, the sister of his mother's boyfriend. This opened a whole new chapter of the saga. Oscar proceeded to detail the events of September 2012, when he was 22 years old. He claimed that he had been romantically involved with Monica Chavez. Some reports suggest she had been his girlfriend, but had broken up with him and he couldn't handle the rejection. On September 9th, 2012, Oscar went to Monica's family home in Otzalotepec, another town in state of Mexico, and murdered her father, Tomas Chavez, by asphyxiation, and gruesomely mutilated the body. He then abducted Monica. For nearly 3 weeks, according to his confession, he held Monica captive, torturing her over several days. Finally, on September 30th, 2012, just shy of her 20th birthday, he strangled Monica to death. He loaded her body onto a hand truck and dumped it down a ravine off a highway on the outskirts of town. Monica's remains were found on October 1st, 2012, and at the time, authorities didn't know who was responsible. In a cruel twist, some local officials initially floated the theory that Monica herself might have killed her father, since she'd disappeared after he died. That notion was later dropped, but the case went cold, until Oscar's jailhouse confession tied all the pieces together. Now it became clear, the young man wanted for the Toluca killings had a trail of blood dating back years, possibly beginning with parricide at age 16, then a double murder in 2012, before the spree in Toluca that spanned 2017 to 2019. Investigators scrambled to corroborate these admissions. Records confirmed that Tomas Chavez had indeed been found stabbed to death in his home in 2012, and Monica's body had been found at the roadside as Oscar described. Back in 2006, Oscar's father's death had never been recorded as a homicide. It seems it was never properly investigated or perhaps misclassified, which sadly is not uncommon if foul play isn't obvious. But in the phone call to his mother, Oscar clearly took credit for killing his father as a teen. There was a distinct coldness in how he told her, "No one will take away what I've done, and I'm not going to tell you I regret it. No." He urged his mother to go on with her life and not worry about him. He even stated, matter-of-factly, that he knew his own fate. Either they kill me, or I kill myself, or I grow old and die in here. His only remaining concern? "What about my pets?" he had asked as one of his first questions to his mother from prison. It was astonishing. The lives of his father, of Monica and her father, of Jessica, Martha, Adriana, and who knows who else, all snuffed out by his hands, and he did not care. He felt no remorse, only self-pity that he'd been caught and an abiding worry over his animals. If there had been any doubt about Oscar's guilt, his own words eradicated it. The prosecution's task was now less about proving who did it, since Oscar effectively confessed multiple times, and more about ensuring ironclad convictions for each crime in court. Mexican law would require separate trials for each major victim, which meant a long road of legal proceedings. But families and activists pressed for swift and firm justice. They wanted this man to face the maximum punishments the system could offer. Before trial, a thorough psychological evaluation of Oscar Garcia Guzman was conducted. Many wondered, was he insane, delusional, or in his right mind? The findings presented by experts like Dr. Fegi Ostrowski, a well-known forensic psychologist, painted the picture of a man who was fully lucid and calculating. Ostrowski concluded Oscar was a psychopathic narcissist, pathologically obsessed with himself, devoid of empathy and hungry for recognition. Yet he wasn't out of touch with reality. He knew exactly what he was doing during his crimes. One interesting aspect Ostrowski noted was the killer's paradoxical love for animals. While many serial murderers torture or kill animals in childhood, Oscar was the opposite. He doted on his dogs and cat. The psychologist theorized that this was a manifestation of his narcissism. Caring for pets allowed Oscar to play the role of protector and receive unconditional loyalty, feeding his ego without challenge. Humans, especially women who could reject or resist him, did not afford him that satisfaction. When they defied his will or tried to leave, he destroyed them. Her profile of Oscar was damning, an intelligent, organized predator who craved control and notoriety, and who exhibited a clear hatred toward women and human life, as one judge later put it in court. Legal proceedings formally began in 2020 and unfolded case by case over the next few years. Since Oscar had committed crimes in different jurisdictions, Toluca, nearby municipalities, plus the Mexico City arrest, coordination between various courts and prosecutors was required. The state of Mexico's prosecutors took the lead on the femicide cases, while also liaising with authorities in the 2012 case from Huixquilucan, where Monica's body was found. The strategy was to secure convictions in the most straightforward cases first, those with the strongest evidence, and then proceed to the older cases. In September 2021, Oscar received his first convictions. A court in Toluca sentenced him to 12 years and 6 months in prison for rape, and 17 years and 6 months for the illegal deprivation of liberty of one of the women. Before even getting to murder, they convicted him of associated crimes, ensuring that if, by some chance, a murder charge failed later, he'd still be locked away for these serious offences. These two initial sentences combined for 30 years, immediately extinguishing any possibility of short-term freedom. On March 30th, 2022, Oscar was found guilty of femicide for the death of a 23-year-old Jessica Guadalupe Jaramillo. The judge sentenced Oscar to 62 years and 6 months in prison for Jessica's murder. In the state of Mexico, that is effectively the maximum sentence for a single count of femicide under law. The next day, another courtroom, another verdict. This time, Oscar was convicted of the homicide of Tomás Chávez, Monica's father, who was killed in his home in 2012. For this murder, Oscar again received 62 years and 6 months behind bars, reflecting the aggravated circumstances. It was premeditated and particularly vicious. The judicial system was treating the murder of Tomás with equal gravity, even though the law labelled it homicidio rather than feminicidio due to the victim's gender. April 20th, 2022. A third trial concluded with a conviction for the femicide of Adriana González Hernández, who was 27 when she vanished in 2017. The court in that case went a step further in its sentencing. Citing the extreme brutality and the societal alarm caused, the judge issued a lifelong prison sentence. In Mexican practice, a lifelong sentence is rare and essentially means the prisoner is not to be considered for release. It underscored that for Adriana's murder, Oscar deserved to spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. Roughly a month later, another state of Mexico court delivered a verdict for the femicide of Martha Patricia Nava Sotelo, who was 25 at the time of her death in February 2019. Oscar was sentenced to 62 years and 6 months for Martha's murder, along with hefty fines and an order to pay over 1.2 million pesos, over $60,000, in restitution to Martha's family. Each sentence came with similar reparation amounts. These financial penalties, while largely symbolic given Oscar's likely indigence, were a legal recognition of the immense harm caused to the victim's loved ones. By mid-2022, at least 6 separate convictions had been secured. 3 for femicides, 1 for the homicide, plus the earlier rape and disappearance sentences. These stacked up to well over 200 years of prison time. In Mexico, sentences are not usually served consecutively beyond certain limits. In many cases, the actual time served cannot exceed 60 or 70 years by law, as there is effectively a cap for human rights reasons. But symbolically and practically, the message was clear. Oscar Garcia Guzman would never walk free again. He would spend the rest of his days in a cell, moving from one grey prison year to the next, his only outings being to hear yet more judges condemn his actions. One major piece remained, the case of Mónica Chávez Cuate, the young woman from 2012 whom Oscar had confessed to killing. This trial took a bit longer to organise, as it required revisiting evidence from a crime 8 years prior and formally indicting Oscar for it. But Mexican justice did not forget Mónica. In October 2023, a court found Oscar guilty of Mónica's femicide as well. He was handed a sentence of 55 years for that crime. With that final judgment, the accounting was complete. All told, Oscar Monstruo de Toluca Guzman was sentenced to cumulative prison time totaling 335 years. Oscar, now in his mid-30s, sat impassively in court as verdict after verdict was read. Occasionally, he would even smirk or roll his eyes, according to reporters present, maintaining that aura of chilling indifference. When victims' families delivered impact statements, Oscar often avoided eye contact. In one hearing, a relative of Jessica's addressed him directly, describing the pain he had caused. He reportedly shrugged. It was clear that remorse was not something he was burdened with. After the 2022 convictions, Oscar was transferred to the Centro Penitenciario de Tenango del Valle, a maximum security prison in the state of Mexico. This facility houses some of the region's most notorious criminals, including other serial killers. Initially, even among hardened convicts, Oscar's crimes marked him for scorn and possible retribution. Word filtered out that other inmates had threatened him. In one instance, there were rumors that an attempt was made to attack him. Prison authorities ended up placing Oscar in a segregated section for his safety, which ironically led to protests by his family. In February 2023, relatives of Oscar and a handful of others even staged a small demonstration outside another prison's gates, complaining that Oscar was being kept in harsh conditions, isolated in a special unit. The families claimed he was being mistreated, an ironic protest considering the suffering Oscar had inflicted on so many others. The Toluca case, along with other contemporaneous femicides, spurred federal lawmakers to take action. In early 2020, Mexico's Congress approved stiffer penalties for gender-based violence, including raising the maximum years for femicide and toughening laws on domestic abuse. Legislators advocating these changes cited the public outrage over cases like Jessica's. In February 2020, during a legislative session, a senator held up images of femicide victims and implored that their deaths not be in vain. The house in Villa Santin where the murders occurred became an object of morbid curiosity. For a time, police guarded it to prevent looting or vandalism, since it was still technically a crime scene. Oscar Garcia Guzman will spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, trading the power he once wielded for the monotony of incarceration. Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate your support. If you're interested in these types of rarely heard global murder cases, we encourage you to give us a follow or even rate us 5 stars on your podcast app, if we may be so bold. It would really help us out a lot. See you next time.